James had always been the kind of man people described as dependable. For 12 years, he had built a life with Rebecca founded on trust, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment. But when she suddenly demanded an open marriage, with her eyes already set on someone else, James shocked everyone with his response. He agreed to her ultimatum, but with one non-negotiable condition that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James Morgan had always approached life with a steady hand and clear principles. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about his appearance. Average height, with salt and pepper hair that had started graying prematurely in his 30s, and laugh lines that deepened around his eyes when he smiled. But there was something undeniably solid about James that drew people to him. In the small New England community of Millfield, where he'd lived his entire adult life, James had earned a reputation as someone you could count on. Whether it was volunteering at the local youth center, helping a neighbor with home repairs, or simply offering a listening ear to a friend in need, James showed up. He didn't make promises lightly, and when he gave his word, it was as good as done. This same steadfastness defined his professional life as an architectural engineer. His colleagues often joked that James built bridges as meticulously as he built relationships, with careful planning, solid foundations, and an eye toward longevity. The structures he designed weren't flashy or revolutionary, but they were reliable, functional, and built to last, just like him. "You know what I love about you, James?" his mentor had once told him during a particularly challenging project. "You understand that integrity isn't just a nice word to throw around. It's about making sure the internal structure matches the external promises. A bridge doesn't collapse because of how it looks. It collapses because of flaws nobody can see." James had taken those words to heart, applying that philosophy to every aspect of his life. He believed that character was built in the private moments when nobody was watching. The small, daily choices to do the right thing, even when it was difficult or inconvenient, were what shaped a person over time. This outlook had served him well in his marriage to Rebecca. For 12 years, they had weathered life's storms together. Financial struggles in the early years, Rebecca's battle with depression after her father's death, the heartbreak of 2 miscarriages before they decided to remain childless. Through it all, James had been Rebecca's rock, providing the steady presence and unwavering support she needed. Their relationship hadn't always been easy, but James believed that anything worth having required effort and commitment. He approached their marriage the same way he approached his architectural projects, with careful attention to the foundation, regular maintenance, and a willingness to adapt when necessary. Every Friday, regardless of how busy work became, James would cook dinner for Rebecca. It wasn't always elaborate, sometimes just pasta with her favorite garlic bread, but the ritual itself mattered. It was their time to reconnect, to share the events of their week, and to simply enjoy each other's company without distractions. On their anniversary each year, James would write Rebecca a letter, chronicling the moments that had strengthened their bond over the previous 12 months. The collection of these letters, stored in a wooden box he had crafted himself, told the story of their marriage, the triumphs and struggles, the laughter and tears, the growth and change they had experienced together. "Marriage isn't about grand gestures," James often said when friends asked for relationship advice. "It's about showing up day after day, especially on the days when you don't feel like it." And James showed up. When Rebecca decided to go back to school at 35 to pursue her master's degree in education, James rearranged his work schedule to give her more time to study. When she decided to start a book club that met in their living room every other Thursday, James made himself scarce, taking long walks around the neighborhood to give her space with her friends. He believed in supporting Rebecca's dreams and ambitions, encouraging her to pursue the things that brought her joy and fulfillment. Her happiness mattered to him, and he took pride in being the kind of partner who helped rather than hindered her growth. Outside of their marriage, James maintained a small but close circle of friends. There was Marcus, his college roommate, who now lived just a few blocks away with his wife and 2 daughters. They met every Saturday morning for a run, regardless of the weather, using the time to discuss everything from work challenges to the Red Sox's chances in the upcoming season. Then there was Ellie, Rebecca's childhood friend who had become like a sister to James over the years. A no-nonsense family lawyer with a heart of gold, Ellie was the person they both turned to when they needed honest advice, delivered with love, but without sugarcoating. And there was Frank, James's mentor from his first job, who had since retired but remained an important presence in his life. At 72, Frank had seen it all and done most of it, offering James the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of experience. These relationships grounded James, providing him with different perspectives and keeping him connected to the world beyond his marriage and career. He valued these friendships deeply, investing time and energy into maintaining them even as life got busy. Despite his solid character and reliable nature, James wasn't perfect. He could be stubborn when he believed he was right, sometimes holding onto his position long after he should have compromised. He had a tendency to internalize stress, working through problems in his head rather than voicing his concerns. And he occasionally retreated into silence when hurt, needing time to process his emotions before he could discuss them. But James was aware of these flaws and worked consciously to address them. He had learned over the years that self-awareness was the first step toward growth, and he was committed to becoming a better version of himself each day. This commitment to personal growth extended to his relationship with Rebecca. James believed that a good marriage required both partners to evolve together, adapting to change while staying true to their core values. He never wanted to be the kind of husband who became complacent, taking his wife's presence for granted, or failing to acknowledge her needs. That's why, when Rebecca had mentioned feeling disconnected 6 months earlier, James had suggested they try couples counseling. It wasn't an admission of failure in his eyes, but rather a proactive step to strengthen their bond. They had attended 8 sessions with Dr. Mitchell, a gentle but insightful therapist who helped them improve their communication patterns and reconnect emotionally, or so James had thought. The therapy sessions had seemed productive at the time. Rebecca had opened up about feeling stuck in a routine, about wanting more excitement and passion in their lives. James had listened, really listened, and made concrete changes. They had taken a weekend trip to Vermont, started a cooking class together, even tried salsa dancing, much to James's chagrin. He had 2 left feet and no sense of rhythm. For a while, things had seemed better. Rebecca had been more affectionate, more present. The spark that had dimmed somewhat over the years appeared to reignite. James had felt hopeful, convinced that their willingness to work on their relationship would see them through this rough patch. That's why Rebecca's announcement over dinner that Friday hit him like a physical blow. They had been eating the roasted chicken with rosemary potatoes that James had prepared, talking about their plans for the upcoming long weekend, when Rebecca set down her fork and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "James, there's something we need to discuss," she had said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of tension that immediately put him on alert. The people in James's life had always provided him with different forms of support, each relationship adding something unique to the tapestry of his existence. As he would soon discover, these connections would prove invaluable when his marriage began to unravel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Fletcher had been James's best friend since their college days at Boston University. They had met as freshmen, randomly assigned as roommates, and despite their different backgrounds, James from a small town in Massachusetts, Marcus from bustling Chicago, they had formed an immediate bond. 20 years later, that bond remained unbroken. Unlike James's methodical, measured approach to life, Marcus lived with infectious enthusiasm. A marketing executive with a booming laugh and boundless energy, he brought a sense of adventure to James's otherwise structured existence. Their Saturday morning runs had become sacred rituals, opportunities for unfiltered conversation and mutual support. The thing about Marcus, James often told people, is that he'll tell me when I'm being an idiot, but he'll never make me feel like one. This honesty had been the cornerstone of their friendship. When James had been hesitant about proposing to Rebecca after just a year of dating, it was Marcus who had pushed him to follow his heart. And when Marcus's first marriage had fallen, apart 5 years ago, James had been there with unwavering support, no judgment, and plenty of late-night conversations over whiskey. Now remarried to Vanessa, a pediatric nurse with a warm smile and no-nonsense attitude, Marcus had rebuilt his life. His daughters, Zoe and Lily, ages 8 and 6, adored their Uncle James, who always brought them intricate wooden puzzles he crafted in his garage workshop. On a deeper level, Marcus understood James in ways others didn't. He recognized the internal pressure James put on himself to be the steady one, the reliable one, the rock. And he was one of the few people who could get James to open up about his vulnerabilities, the fears and doubts he carefully concealed beneath his composed exterior. "You know," Marcus had told him during a particularly grueling uphill stretch of their run last month, "it's okay to not have all the answers sometimes. Being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone." James had nodded, grateful for the reminder, but unsure if he could truly embody it. Being dependable wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. The idea of letting that go, even momentarily, felt like losing part of his identity. If Marcus represented uninhibited honesty in James's life, then Ellie Richardson embodied fierce loyalty. Rebecca's best friend since 3rd grade, Ellie had initially been skeptical of James when they started dating. She had watched Rebecca go through a series of relationships with charming but ultimately unreliable men, and she wasn't convinced James would be any different. "I've seen too many men make promises they never intended to keep," she had told him bluntly during their first one-on-one conversation. "Rebecca deserves better than pretty words." James had appreciated her protectiveness. "I agree completely," he'd replied. "Judge me by my actions, not my words." And over the years, Ellie had done exactly that. As she witnessed James's consistent dedication to Rebecca, her skepticism had transformed into respect and eventually into a deep friendship that existed independently of her relationship with Rebecca. At 43, Ellie was a formidable presence. A family lawyer who had clawed her way up from a tough childhood in South Boston, she approached life with straightforward determination. Divorced at 30, after a brief, tumultuous marriage, she had thrown herself into her career, becoming a fierce advocate for her clients, particularly in complex custody cases. Despite her tough exterior, Ellie had a soft spot for James. She appreciated his steady nature and the way he had always treated Rebecca with respect and consideration. They had developed a tradition of monthly lunch meetings, ostensibly to catch up, but often evolving into deep discussions about life, relationships, and personal growth. "You know what I like about you, James," she had said during their lunch last week. "You don't try to fix everything. You listen. Do you know how rare that is?" James had smiled, taking the compliment in stride. "I learned early on that sometimes people just need to be heard." "Well," Rebecca is lucky to have found. That, God knows I haven't in any of my relationships. Looking back now, James wondered if he had missed something in Ellie's tone that day. Had there been a hint of concern, a subtle warning he had failed to pick up on? Then there was Frank Donovan, the man who had shaped James's professional and, in many ways, personal development. At 72, Frank had the kind of weathered face that told stories without words, each line a testament to a life fully lived. His silver hair was always impeccably combed, and he still wore a tie most days, a habit from his 40 years as a structural engineer. James had been fresh out of college when he joined the firm where Frank was a senior partner. Intimidated by the older man's reputation for excellence and exacting standards, James had worked twice as hard to impress him. What he hadn't expected was Frank's generosity of spirit, the way he freely shared his knowledge, patiently mentoring James through complex projects and challenging situations. Engineering isn't just about math and materials, Frank had told him repeatedly. It's about understanding how things connect, how they bear weight, and where they might fail under pressure. Not so different from life, when you think about it. When Frank retired 7 years ago, he had specifically requested that James take over his ongoing projects, a vote of confidence that had meant more than any formal recognition. Since then, their professional relationship had evolved into a deep friendship. They met for lunch on the first Monday of every month at Donovan's, a small Irish pub owned by Frank's cousin. During these lunches, Frank shared stories from his 50-year marriage to his late wife, Grace. He spoke of the challenges they had overcome, the joy they had found in simple moments, and the growth that came from weathering life's storms together. "Marriage is like a bridge, James," Frank had said once. "It needs constant maintenance. Ignore small problems, and eventually you'll have structural failure." James had taken this advice to heart, applying Frank's wisdom to his relationship with Rebecca. He checked in regularly, addressed issues as they arose, and never took the stability of their marriage for granted. Frank had lost Grace to cancer 3 years ago, and in his grief, he had turned to James for support. Watching this towering figure in his life grapple with such profound loss had given James a new appreciation for the fragility of life and relationships. It had reinforced his commitment to never taking Rebecca for granted, to cherishing each day they had together. What would Frank advise him now, James wondered, if he knew what was happening? While Marcus, Ellie, and Frank formed the core of James's support system, there were others who played important roles in his life. There was his sister, Catherine, 5 years his junior, who lived in Seattle with her husband and 3 children. Though separated by distance, they maintained a close relationship through weekly video calls and annual visits. Catherine had always looked up to her big brother, turning to him for advice and support through various life challenges. In return, she offered James perspective and occasionally called him out when his stubborn streak threatened to get the better of him. "You always think you need to be the strong one," she had told him during their last conversation. But sometimes, strength is knowing when to lean on others. At his workplace, James had developed a mentoring relationship with Aidan Chen, a brilliant young engineer who reminded James of himself 20 years ago. Guiding Aidan's development had given James a sense of purpose beyond his own career achievements, allowing him to pass on the wisdom Frank had once shared with him. Then there were Rebecca's parents, Howard and Diane Miller. Unlike many men, James had always gotten along well with his in-laws. Howard, a retired high school principal with a dry wit and encyclopedic knowledge of Civil War history, had welcomed James into the family without reservation. Diane, warm and nurturing, treated James like the son she never had. They had been devastated when Rebecca struggled with depression after Howard's heart attack 5 years ago. James had coordinated her therapy appointments, managed the household, and provided updates to Diane, who was torn between supporting her husband's recovery and helping her daughter. That period had strengthened James's bond with his in-laws, earning him a depth of gratitude and respect that went beyond typical family ties. "I don't know what we would have done without you," Diane had told him afterward. "You're the best thing that ever happened to our daughter." These words had filled James with pride and reinforced his commitment to being the husband Rebecca deserved. Now, as he faced the greatest challenge of their marriage, he wondered how these same in-laws would react. Would they stand by him? Or would their loyalty to their daughter override the relationship they had built with him over the years? The thought of potentially losing not just Rebecca, but this extended family he had come to love was almost unbearable. As James would soon discover, the true test of any support network comes when life falls apart. Some people who seem steadfast disappear when things get difficult. Others, sometimes the least expected, step forward with surprising strength. And occasionally, those closest to you reveal aspects of themselves you never suspected existed. In the days and weeks to come, James would learn exactly who he could count on and who he couldn't. The map of his relationships would be redrawn in ways he never could have anticipated, challenging his understanding of loyalty, friendship, and family. But on that Friday evening, as he sat across from Rebecca at their dining table, James didn't yet know how crucial these connections would become. He couldn't have predicted which relationships would strengthen in the fire of adversity and which would dissolve like smoke. All he knew was that something in his wife's expression told him their life together was about to change fundamentally. And he was right. He had nodded, setting down his own fork and giving her his full attention. Whatever was coming, James would face it head-on, just as he had faced every other challenge in their marriage. But nothing could have prepared him for what Rebecca said next. The words that would test his principles, his patience, and his perspective. On the marriage he had believed in for 12 years. Words that would force him to make one of the most difficult decisions of his life, revealing aspects of his character even he hadn't fully understood until that moment. Little did James know that his response to Rebecca's demand would not only determine the future of their marriage, but would also reveal the true nature of the woman he had dedicated his life to for over a decade. From the outside, James and Rebecca, Morgan's marriage appeared to be the kind others aspired to. Their Tudor-style home on Maple Street, with its meticulously maintained garden and welcoming front porch, seemed to embody the stability and comfort of their relationship. On Sunday mornings, neighbors would see them walking hand in hand to the local cafe for brunch, exchanging pleasant conversation with everyone they passed. During summer block parties, Rebecca would bring her famous lemon bars while James manned the grill, their easy companionship evident in the way they moved around each other, anticipating needs without words. But as with any relationship, the public face of their marriage told only part of the story. Behind closed doors, James and Rebecca had crafted a life together that was both deeply meaningful and, in recent years, increasingly complex. They had met at a mutual friend's wedding 12 years ago. James, then 30, had been the best man, while Rebecca, 28, was a bridesmaid. Their initial interaction had been brief, a short conversation during the rehearsal dinner, followed by the traditional walk down the aisle together during the ceremony. But something in that brief encounter had sparked James's interest, and he had sought her out during the reception. "I remember thinking you were different," Rebecca had told him years later. "Most guys at weddings are either aggressively hitting on the bridesmaids or completely checked out, but you asked questions and actually listened to the answers." Their first date had been a week later, dinner at a small Italian restaurant followed by a walk along the Charles River. 3 hours of conversation had flown by, touching on everything from childhood memories to professional aspirations to philosophical views on life and relationships. By the end of the evening, James had known there was something special about Rebecca Miller. Her intelligence was evident in the way she articulated complex ideas with clarity and precision. As a high school English teacher, she had a gift for making literature accessible without oversimplifying its depth. She spoke passionately about her students, her face lighting up when she described the moment a reluctant reader finally connected with a text, but it was her combination of strength and vulnerability that had truly captured James's heart. Rebecca had been raised by loving but demanding parents who had high expectations for their only child. This upbringing had instilled in her both ambition and a persistent desire for approval that she constantly worked to overcome. On their third date, she had confessed her tendency toward perfectionism, describing how she would spend hours revising lesson plans and agonizing over student evaluations. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel like I'm good enough," she had admitted, looking simultaneously embarrassed and relieved to speak the truth out loud. James had recognized something of himself in this admission, his own drive to meet and exceed expectations, his need to be the dependable one. This shared understanding had created an immediate bond between them. Their courtship had progressed steadily, each step forward feeling natural and right. 6 months in, they were spending most nights together at James's apartment. At 1 year, he proposed during a weekend trip to the Maine coast, presenting her with a vintage sapphire ring that had belonged to his grandmother. The wedding had been modest but meaningful, held in the garden of Rebecca's parents' home with 70 close friends and family members in attendance. They had written their own vows, promises that went beyond the traditional script to address their specific hopes and commitments to each other. "I promise to celebrate your successes as my own," James had said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "To support your dreams even when they scare me, to remind you of your strength when you forget it." Rebecca's vows had been equally personal. "I promise to be honest, even when the truth is difficult, to grow with you rather than apart from you, to choose us every day through whatever life brings." Those first few years of marriage had been both challenging and deeply fulfilling. They had bought their house, a fixer-upper that required significant renovation. Weekends were spent stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, and painting endless walls. The shared project had strengthened their bond, teaching them how to work together through frustration and fatigue. Professionally, they had each faced transitions. James had been promoted to senior engineer, bringing greater responsibility and longer hours. Rebecca had taken on the role of department chair at her school, a position that added administrative duties to her teaching load. They had navigated these changes as a team, adjusting schedules and expectations to support each other's growth. Financial struggles had come early in their marriage. James had student loans from his master's degree, and they had stretched their budget to afford their home. There had been months when they counted pennies until payday, sharing a single glass of wine over home-cooked meals rather than going out. But even those lean times had held a certain sweetness, a sense that they were building something together, one careful step at a time. The decision not to have children had evolved gradually. After 2 heartbreaking miscarriages in their 5th year of marriage, they had taken time to heal and reflect. Rebecca had struggled with depression during this period, questioning her body and her worth. James had held her through countless nights of tears, assuring her that their family could take many forms. "What matters is us," he had told her. "You are enough for me, more than enough. Whatever our future looks like, we'll face it together." Eventually, they had made peace with a child-free life, finding meaning and fulfillment in other ways. Rebecca mentored struggling students, providing the maternal guidance many of them lacked at home. James volunteered with a program that taught engineering concepts to inner-city youth. They became the favorite aunt and uncle to Marcus's daughters and Catherine's children, hosting special weekends throughout the year that created lasting memories. Their daily rhythm had settled into a comfortable pattern over the years. Mornings began with coffee shared at the kitchen island, a quick check-in about the day ahead before heading to their respective workplaces. Evenings typically found them in the living room, Rebecca grading papers on the sofa, while James read in his armchair, companionable silence broken by occasional observations or questions. Fridays were special. James's night to cook, a tradition that had begun during their first year of marriage, when Rebecca was working late to supervise drama rehearsals. What started as a practical solution had evolved into a cherished ritual, with James experimenting with new recipes or perfecting old favorites. The meal was always served with proper place settings and candles, a way of marking the transition. From work, week to weekend, they had activities they enjoyed together, hiking in the nearby state park, attending community theater productions, taking cooking classes at the local culinary school. But they also maintained independent interests and friendships. Rebecca had her book club and volunteer work at the literacy center. James had his woodworking and monthly poker nights with colleagues. This balance of togetherness and autonomy had seemed like a strength in their relationship, a healthy recognition that marriage didn't mean losing individual identity. James had always believed that supporting Rebecca's independence made their bond stronger, not weaker. Sex between them had changed over the years, as it does in most long-term relationships. The urgent passion of their early days had evolved into something more knowable but no less meaningful. There were dry spells during particularly stressful work periods or when Rebecca was struggling with depression. But there were also unexpected moments of reconnection. Weekends away that rekindled desire, ordinary evenings that suddenly turned intimate. James had always been attentive to Rebecca's needs, believing that physical intimacy was an extension of the care they showed each other in all aspects of life. He noticed when she seemed distant or preoccupied during sex, and he wasn't afraid to ask what she needed or wanted. This openness had created a physical relationship built on trust and mutual satisfaction. But in the past year, something had shifted. Rebecca had become more reserved, both emotionally and physically. Conversations that once flowed easily became stilted. She spent more time on her phone, quickly putting it away when James entered the room. Their sex life, which had always ebbed and flowed naturally, entered a prolonged drought with no clear explanation. At first, James had attributed these changes to work stress. Rebecca's school was implementing a new curriculum, requiring teachers to completely overhaul their lesson plans. The pressure was immense, with administrators conducting frequent observations and demanding detailed documentation. It made sense that she would be distracted and depleted. But as months passed and the distance between them grew, James had become increasingly concerned. He suggested a weekend away, hoping that a change of scenery might help them reconnect. They had spent 2 days at a coastal bed and breakfast, walking on the beach and eating at nice restaurants. There had been moments of the old ease between them, but Rebecca remained somehow absent, her mind clearly elsewhere, even when her body was present. "Is everything okay?" James had asked as they drove home. "You seem, I don't know, like you're not really here with me." Rebecca had offered a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just tired. This new curriculum is killing me." But James knew his wife well enough to recognize when she wasn't telling the whole truth. After another month of increasing disconnection, he had suggested couples counseling. To his surprise, Rebecca had agreed readily, almost eagerly. Dr. Mitchell, a kind woman with silver-streaked hair and perceptive eyes, had guided them through exercises designed to improve communication and rebuild intimacy. James had approached these sessions with genuine commitment, sharing his feelings openly and listening attentively to Rebecca's responses. He had believed they were making progress, especially when Rebecca began initiating physical affection. Again, curling up next to him on the sofa in the evenings, or reaching for his hand across the dinner table. Looking back now, James wondered if he had been seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was actually happening. Had the renewed affection been genuine, or had it been a performance designed to allay his suspicions? Had Rebecca been working to save their marriage during those counseling sessions, or had she been buying time while she figured out what she really wanted? These questions haunted him now as he sat across from her at their dining table, watching her gather herself to say whatever came next. The candlelight that usually made these Friday dinners feel special now cast strange shadows across her face, making her look almost like a stranger. James took a breath, steeling himself. Whatever Rebecca was about to say, he would face it with the same steady resolve that had carried him through life's other challenges. Their marriage wasn't perfect, no relationship was, but it was built on 12 years of shared history, mutual respect, and genuine love. That had to count for something, didn't it? I think we need to try something different in our marriage, Rebecca said, setting down her wineglass with deliberate care. The words hung in the air between them, landing with the quiet impact of a stone dropped into still water. James felt his heart rate quicken, but he kept his expression neutral, waiting for her to continue. Rebecca tucked a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture he recognized from countless difficult conversations over their years together. She looked beautiful in the soft light of their dining room, her angular face softened by the candles James had lit, her green eyes bright with emotion. She wore the silver necklace he had given her for their 10th anniversary, a delicate pendant that rested just above the neckline of her navy blouse. "Different how?" James asked, his voice steady despite the unease spreading through his chest. Rebecca took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we started therapy about what I want, what I need." She paused, looking down at her half-eaten meal. "The thing is, James, I feel like I've missed out on so much. We got together when I was 28. Before you, my longest relationship was just over a year." James nodded slowly, unsure where this was heading, but already feeling the ground shifting beneath him. And I love you," Rebecca said quickly, almost defensively. "I do, but I've been feeling confined. Like there are parts of myself I haven't been able to explore because I've been in this relationship for my entire adult life." A cold weight settled in James's stomach. He set down his fork, no longer interested, in the roasted chicken he'd spent the afternoon preparing. "What exactly are you saying, Rebecca?" She met his eyes then, her gaze direct in a way that made him realize she had rehearsed this conversation in her mind many times. "I'm saying I want us to try an open marriage." The words struck James like a physical blow. Whatever he had been expecting, complaints about his work hours, frustrations about their social life, even accusations of him being emotionally distant, it wasn't this, an open marriage. The concept was so foreign to everything he understood. About their relationship, about who they were together. "An open marriage," he repeated, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "You want us to see other people?" "Not exactly," Rebecca said, leaning forward slightly. "I don't want to end our marriage or diminish what we have. I just want the freedom to explore connections with others, physically and emotionally." James felt a flash of anger, quickly followed by confusion. "So you want permission to have affairs?" Rebecca flinched at the word. "That's not how I see it. Affairs are about deception. This would be honest, with agreed-upon boundaries." "When did you start thinking about this?" James asked, trying to understand how his wife could have arrived at a place so different from where he stood. Rebecca hesitated, and in that pause, James sensed there was more to the story than philosophical musings about relationship structures. "A few months ago," she finally admitted. But really, I think these feelings have been building for years. I just didn't have the framework to understand them until recently. The framework, James repeated. Something in her choice of words struck him as rehearsed, borrowed from someone else. Did someone introduce you to this idea? Is there someone specific you're interested in? The flush that spread across Rebecca's cheeks answered his question, before her words could. That's not really the point. It is the point, James interrupted, his calm facade beginning to crack. If you're asking me to fundamentally change the structure of our marriage, I deserve complete honesty. Is there someone else, Rebecca? She looked away, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her wineglass. His name is David. He's the new vice principal at school. The name hit James with unexpected force. David. An abstract concept suddenly made concrete, a shadowy threat given form and substance. A man with a name who worked with his wife every day, who had somehow convinced her that their 12 years of marriage was a constraint rather than a foundation. How long? James asked, his voice now tight with suppressed emotion. Nothing has happened, Rebecca said quickly. I haven't cheated on you, James. That's why I'm having this conversation. I wanted to be honest before what, James? Cut in. Before you sleep with him, is that what this is about? You want my blessing to pursue your boss? He's not my boss exactly, Rebecca corrected, a response so beside the point that James almost laughed. That's what you're focused on right now, his exact position in the school hierarchy. Rebecca looked chastened. No, you're right, that doesn't matter. She took another sip of wine, visibly gathering herself. What matters is that I've been having these feelings, and instead of acting on them behind your back, I'm coming to you. Isn't that what we promised in therapy? Complete honesty? James stood up abruptly, needing to move, to process the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the darkened backyard where they had hosted countless summer barbecues with friends, where they had planned to build a fire pit this spring. Honesty doesn't mean I have to accept whatever you want, he said finally, turning back to face her. You're asking me to rewrite the fundamental terms of our relationship, Rebecca, the relationship we both committed to exclusively 12 years ago. People change, she said softly. Relationships evolve. If we can't adapt, we stagnate. This isn't about adaptation, James countered. This is about you wanting something completely different than what we built together. Something that contradicts the promises we made to each other. Rebecca stood then, crossing the room to stand before him. She reached for his hands, and after a moment's hesitation, he allowed her to take them. Her touch, once so comforting, now felt like a stranger's. James, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I love you. You're my best friend. My partner in so many ways. I don't want to lose that, but I also need to be honest about what I'm feeling, about what I think I need at this point in my life. James looked down at their joined hands, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the Rebecca he thought he knew. The woman who had stood before their friends and family and promised to choose him every day through whatever life brought. And what about what I need? He asked quietly. Have you considered that? A flicker of something, guilt, uncertainty, crossed Rebecca's face. Of course I have. That's why I'm proposing an open marriage rather than just leaving me, James finished, when she trailed off. How considerate. Rebecca dropped his hands, stepping back. That's not fair. I'm trying to find a way forward that honors both our needs. Both our needs, James repeated. And what if my need is for my wife to be faithful to me? What if monogamy isn't just some arbitrary restriction I've placed on you, but an essential part of how I understand marriage? Rebecca's expression hardened slightly. Then we have a fundamental incompatibility. The clinical tone of her response stunned James. 12 years reduced to a fundamental incompatibility, as if they were discussing a business merger rather than the intimate bond they had spent over a decade building. "Let me make sure I understand what you're saying," James said, fighting to keep his voice level. "Either I agree to an open marriage that allows you to pursue David, or our relationship is over. Those are my options." Rebecca's brow furrowed. "I wouldn't put it so starkly. I'm hoping we can discuss this, find a compromise." "What's the compromise between monogamy and non-monogamy, Rebecca?" James asked. "This isn't like negotiating vacation destinations or what color to paint the living room. This is binary. Either we're exclusive or we're not." "There are many ways to structure ethical non-monogamy," Rebecca replied, the rehearsed quality returning to her voice. "We could start with specific boundaries, check in regularly, prioritize our relationship while allowing space for you to sleep with David," James finished bluntly. Rebecca's cheeks flushed again. "It's not just about sex." "That makes it worse, not better," James said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're telling me you have emotional feelings for this man, and you want my permission to explore them while keeping me as what? A safety net? A backup plan? As my husband," Rebecca insisted, "as the primary relationship in my life." James laughed then, a short, bitter sound that surprised even him. "That's not how it works, Rebecca. You don't get to claim primacy while actively undermining the foundation of our marriage." They stood in tense silence for a moment, the remnants of their romantic dinner forgotten on the table behind them. James felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, the life he had built with Rebecca crumbling beneath his feet. "So those are my options?" he asked finally. "Accept an open marriage or lose you completely?" Something flickered in Rebecca's eyes, a moment of doubt, perhaps, or recognition of the magnitude of what she was asking. But it passed quickly, replaced by a determined expression he had seen many times before, though never directed at him with such potential for harm. "I need this, James. I need the freedom to explore who I am outside the constraints of conventional marriage. I've spent too many years living within boundaries that feel increasingly suffocating." She took a deep breath. "But I don't want to lose you. I think we can find a way to make this work if you're willing to try." James looked at his wife, the woman he had loved and supported for 12 years, through career changes and family losses, through miscarriages and depression, through all the ordinary challenges of building a life together. He saw in her face a determination he recognized, the same quality that had drawn him to her initially. But now that determination was focused on something that threatened to destroy everything they had built. "I need time to think," he said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make standing here in our kitchen on a Friday night." Rebecca nodded, visible relief washing over her face. "Of course, take whatever time you need. I know this is a lot to process." The normalcy of her response, as if they were discussing a job offer or a major purchase rather than the complete redefinition of their marriage, struck James as surreal. But he simply nodded, turning away from her to begin mechanically clearing the table, needing physical activity to ground himself in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. As he scraped uneaten food into the trash, his mind worked furiously, processing what had just happened and what it meant for their future. One thought kept returning, a question he couldn't shake despite the chaos of emotions swirling within him. Who was this woman, and what had she done with the Rebecca he thought he knew? James barely slept that night. After mechanically finishing the dishes, he had retreated to the guest bedroom, unable to lie beside Rebecca, while his mind churned with questions and emotions he couldn't yet sort through. She hadn't protested, seeming to understand that he needed space, though he caught a flicker of surprise in her eyes when he gathered his pillow and a change of clothes. In the quiet darkness of the spare room, surrounded by boxes of holiday decorations, and Rebecca's old teaching materials, James stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened. His thoughts circled relentlessly, examining their conversation from every angle, searching for something he might have misunderstood or misinterpreted. But the reality was painfully clear. Rebecca, his wife of 12 years, the woman he had built, his life around, wanted to fundamentally change the terms of their marriage. She wanted the freedom to pursue a relationship, emotional and physical, with another man while keeping James as her primary partner, whatever that meant. As the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, James rose, exhausted but oddly clear-headed. A night of restless contemplation had distilled his thoughts into something resembling certainty. He knew what he needed to do. He showered and, dressed in the guest bathroom, then made his way downstairs. The house was silent. Rebecca was still asleep. James put on coffee, the familiar ritual grounding him as he prepared for the conversation ahead. He heard her before he saw her. The creak of the seventh stair that they'd never fixed. The soft padding of her feet across the hardwood floor. When Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway, she looked as tired as he felt. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore the faded MIT sweatshirt he had given her years ago. "Morning," she said tentatively, her voice still rough with sleep. James nodded, pouring a cup of coffee and sliding it across the counter to her. 2 sugars, splash of cream, the way she'd taken it for 12 years. The familiar gesture felt strange now, an echo of intimacy that no longer matched their reality. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the mug but making no move to drink. "Did you sleep at all?" "Not really," James admitted. He leaned against the counter, his own coffee untouched. "I've been thinking about what you said, about what you want." Rebecca nodded, her expression cautious but attentive. "And?" James met her gaze directly. "I need to understand something first. Is this truly about exploring who you are, or is it specifically about David?" Rebecca hesitated, and in that pause, James had his answer. Still, he waited for her to speak. "Both, I think," she finally said. "My feelings for David woke something in me. Questions about whether monogamy is really the only way to have a meaningful relationship. But even if David weren't in the picture, I think I'd still be questioning whether traditional marriage is right for me at this point in my life." James absorbed this, noting the careful way she framed her response, the language that sounded borrowed, from books or websites, rather than her own heart. "And if I say no to an open marriage, what then?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "I don't know," she admitted. "I care about you deeply, James. You've been my partner in everything for 12 years. The thought of losing that terrifies me. But it doesn't terrify you enough to choose me over the possibility of being with David," James observed, keeping his tone neutral despite the pain beneath his words. Rebecca looked down. "It's not that simple." "Actually, I think it is," James said, surprising himself with the clarity he felt. "You're asking me to accept something that contradicts everything I believe about marriage, about the promises we made to each other. You're asking me to fundamentally change who I am to accommodate your desire for someone else." "I'm not asking you to change who you are," Rebecca protested. "You could explore connections with others too. This could be freeing for both of us." James shook his head. "That's not who I am, Rebecca. I've never wanted multiple relationships. When I married you, I chose you completely and exclusively. That wasn't a temporary choice or a phase I was going through. It was a reflection of my deepest values about love and commitment." He set his coffee cup down and moved to the kitchen table, needing the formality of sitting across from her rather than standing in casual proximity. After a moment, Rebecca followed, sliding into her usual chair. "I've thought about this all night," James continued, "and I've realized something important. An open marriage isn't something I can agree to because it violates my core principles about what marriage means. I won't compromise on that." Not even for you." Rebecca's face fell, though she didn't look entirely surprised. "So that's it? You won't even consider it?" "I didn't say that was it," James replied, his tone measured. "I said I can't agree to an open marriage, but I am willing to offer an alternative." Rebecca looked up, cautious hope flickering in her eyes. "What alternative?" James took a deep breath, steadying himself for what came next. "A divorce." The word hung between them, heavier and more final than any they had exchanged the previous evening. Rebecca flinched as if he had slapped her. "Divorce?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'd rather end our marriage completely than try to find a compromise." "This isn't about compromise," James said firmly. "Some things can't be compromised on without destroying their fundamental nature. My view of marriage, of the promises we made to each other, is one of those things." He reached across the table, not quite touching her, but extending his hand in a gesture of openness. "I love you, Rebecca. These 12 years have been the most meaningful of my life, but I won't live in a marriage where I have to pretend I'm okay with my wife being with other men. I deserve better than that, and honestly, so do you." "How can you say I deserve better when you're the one ending things?" Rebecca asked, tears forming in her eyes. "Because you deserve to be with someone who shares your vision of what a relationship should be," James explained. "Someone who enthusiastically wants the same kind of life you want, and I deserve the same. Trying to force each other into relationship, models we don't believe in, would only lead to resentment and pain for both of us." Rebecca wiped away a tear. "But what if this is just a phase? What if I'm making a terrible mistake and throwing away everything we have?" James felt a surge of emotion at her words, a complicated mixture of hope, skepticism, and sadness. "If you're not sure, then we should pause this entire conversation until you are. Marriage isn't something to experiment with, Rebecca. People get hurt, deeply hurt, when we treat commitment as flexible or provisional." "That's not what I'm doing," she protested. "Isn't it?" James challenged gently. "You're essentially saying our vows, the exclusive commitment we made to each other, no longer apply because you're interested in someone else. How is that not treating our marriage as provisional?" Rebecca had no immediate answer. Her expression conflicted. James continued, his voice softening slightly. "Look, I understand that feelings happen. I'm not angry that you're attracted to David. What I'm struggling with is your belief that those feelings justify rewriting our entire relationship." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I also respect your autonomy. If this is truly what you want, what you need, then I won't stand in your way. I just won't participate in it either." "So, those are my choices?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Either recommit to monogamy or get divorced." "Those are the options I can offer with integrity," James confirmed. "But there's another aspect to this we need to discuss." "What's that?" Rebecca asked warily. "I'm willing to agree to a divorce with one condition," James said, his gaze steady despite the gravity of his words. Rebecca tensed visibly. "What condition?" "Honesty," James stated simply. "Complete transparency about why we're ending our marriage, not just to ourselves, but to our families, our friends, our colleagues." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You want me to tell everyone I asked for an open marriage?" "I want us both to be truthful," James clarified. "I won't lie or create a convenient fiction like we grew apart or we wanted different things. If we divorce, it will be because you want the freedom to pursue relationships with other men, starting with David, and I'm unwilling to remain married under those terms." Color drained from Rebecca's face. "That would humiliate me. My parents, my colleagues, I'm not suggesting we announce it on social media or send out a press release," James interrupted. "But when people ask, and they will ask, I won't lie, and I'm asking you not to lie either." "Why?" Rebecca demanded. A flash of anger breaking through her shock. "Why is that so important to you?" "Because truth matters," James said firmly. "Because I won't carry the burden of a false narrative about the end of our marriage. And because choices have consequences, Rebecca. If you choose to end our marriage to pursue David or anyone else, you should be willing to own that decision openly." Rebecca stared at him, seeming to see him in a new light. "I never expected this from you," she said finally. "This ultimatum." "It's not an ultimatum," James corrected. "It's a boundary. I'm telling you what I can and cannot live with. You're free to make whatever choice feels right to you." They sat in silence for several long moments, the morning light strengthening around them, illuminating the kitchen where they had shared thousands of meals, conversations, and quiet moments together. The space felt different now, charged with the weight of decisions that could not be unmade. "I need to think," Rebecca said finally, echoing his words from the previous night. "This isn't what I expected." James nodded, a profound sadness settling over him despite his certainty about his position. "Take whatever time you need, but Rebecca, I need you to understand that I won't change my mind about this. I can't compromise on the fundamental nature of marriage and still be true to myself." She studied his face, perhaps searching for signs of flexibility or uncertainty. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I hear you," she said quietly, "and I respect your clarity, even if it's not what I hoped for." As she rose from the table, coffee untouched and growing cold, James remained seated, watching her leave the kitchen. Her shoulders were slumped slightly, the confident posture of the previous evening replaced by the weight of consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. James felt no triumph in this moment, no vindication in standing his ground. There was only the hollow ache of recognizing that sometimes love isn't enough when core values diverge so fundamentally. And now all he could do was wait for Rebecca to decide which path she would choose. The weekend that followed their conversation passed in a strange limbo. James and Rebecca moved through their home like ghosts, carefully avoiding direct contact while maintaining a veneer of civility when interaction was unavoidable. James spent most of Saturday in his workshop, in the garage, losing himself in the familiar comfort of woodworking. The methodical process of measuring, cutting, and sanding provided a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm him if he allowed his mind to wander. He was crafting a small jewelry box from cherry wood, a project he had started weeks ago as a surprise gift for Rebecca's upcoming birthday. The irony wasn't lost on him as he traced his fingers over the half-finished lid, wondering if she would still be his wife when May arrived. Rebecca, meanwhile, remained largely in their bedroom, emerging occasionally for food or coffee. James heard her on the phone several times, speaking in hushed tones that fell silent whenever he approached. He didn't try to eavesdrop, respecting her privacy, even as he wondered if she was talking to David, weighing the prospect of a relationship with him against the consequences James had outlined. By Sunday afternoon, the silence had become unbearable. James found Rebecca sitting in the backyard, bundled in a sweater against the early spring chill, staring at nothing in particular. "Can I join you?" he asked, hovering by the patio door. She nodded, wrapping her arms more tightly around herself. James sat in the adjacent chair, noticing how she didn't turn to face him. "We should probably talk about practical matters," he said gently. "Regardless of what you decide, we need to figure out the next few days." Rebecca nodded again, finally looking at him. Her eyes were rimmed with red, evidence of tears he hadn't witnessed. "I have to go back to work tomorrow," she said, her voice rough. "I can't avoid it." "Which means you'll see David," James observed, keeping his tone neutral. "Yes." A pause. "I don't know what to say to him." James considered this. That depends on what you're leaning toward deciding, doesn't it? Rebecca looked away. I don't know yet. Everything seemed so clear before I talked to you. Now I'm just confused. James felt a flicker of hope at her words, quickly tempered by caution. Confused about what you want, or confused about the consequences of getting it? Both, I think. She turned back to him, her expression pained. I didn't expect you to be so decisive. Would it have been better if I had fallen apart? James asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. No, but... Rebecca hesitated. I guess I thought you might be more willing to at least try what I was suggesting, that you might love me enough to step outside your comfort zone. The implication stung, but James kept his composure. This isn't about loving you enough, Rebecca. It's about being true to myself and my principles. Compromising on something this fundamental wouldn't be an act of love. It would be self-erasure. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. It feels like my only options are to deny a part of myself or lose you completely. I understand that's how it feels, James acknowledged. But from where I stand, you're asking me to accept something that would require me to deny an essential part of who I am. We're at an impasse where someone's core needs will go unmet either way. The truth of this settled between them, heavy and undeniable. What about tomorrow? Rebecca asked, changing the subject. Should I stay somewhere else while I'm figuring this out? James considered the question carefully. The thought of Rebecca leaving, of their home empty of her presence, created a hollow feeling in his chest. But the alternative, continuing in this strained limbo under the same roof, seemed equally painful. That might be best, he said finally. Some physical distance might help us both think more clearly. Rebecca nodded, looking relieved and saddened simultaneously. I could stay with Ellie for a few days. James tensed involuntarily at the mention of Ellie. Rebecca's best friend would inevitably become involved in this situation, and he wondered what version of events she would hear. If you stay with Ellie, what will you tell her? The question hung between them, the first practical test of his condition about honesty. Rebecca studied him, measuring his resolve. The truth, she said finally. Or at least enough of it that she understands why I need a place to stay. Thank you, James said, genuinely appreciative. I know that won't be easy. None of this is easy, Rebecca replied, a tremor in her voice. I never wanted to hurt you, James. I hope you believe that. I do, he said, and he meant it. Whatever else was happening between them, he didn't believe Rebecca had set out to cause him pain. She had simply reached for what she wanted without fully considering the impact on others, a kind of carelessness rather than cruelty. They sat in silence for several minutes, the gentle sounds of the neighborhood, distant lawnmowers, children, playing, a dog barking, continuing around them as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis. I should pack some things, Rebecca said eventually, rising from her chair. James nodded, remaining seated as she went inside. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, the creak of their bedroom door, the muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing, the ordinary noises of his wife preparing to leave their home, perhaps for the last time. Later that evening, after Rebecca had departed for Ellie's with a suitcase and tearful, awkward hug at the door, James sat alone in their living room, the silence of the house pressing in around him. The reality of what was happening, the possible end of his marriage, hit him with full force now that he was alone. His chest tightened with grief, and he allowed himself for the first time since Rebecca's initial revelation to weep openly. The tears came in waves, released without shame or restraint in the privacy of his empty home. He cried for the life they had built together, for the future he had imagined, for the trust that had been broken. He cried until his body ached and his eyes burned, until the grief had wrung him out completely, leaving him hollowed and spent on the sofa they had chosen together during their 3rd year of marriage. When the storm of emotion finally passed, James felt different, not better exactly, but more clear-eyed about the road ahead. He had given Rebecca an honest choice, and now he had to prepare himself for either outcome. If she chose to recommit to their marriage, they would have significant work to do rebuilding trust and understanding. If she chose divorce, he would need to find the strength to start over at 42, to reimagine a future without the woman who had been at the center of his life for 12 years. Either way, he refused to compromise his integrity or his principles. That certainty, at least, provided a solid foundation beneath his feet as everything else shifted around him. The next morning, James called his boss and requested a few days off, explaining simply that he was dealing with a personal matter. Michael, the head of the engineering firm, and someone James had worked with for over a decade, didn't press for details. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "The Westbrook project can wait." James was grateful for the understanding and the space to process what was happening without the added pressure of work. He spent Monday in a kind of productive distraction, tackling home maintenance projects he had been putting off, fixing that squeaky stair, finally painting the guest bathroom, organizing the mess of tools that had accumulated in the garage. The shoe. Physical labor helped occupy his mind and exhaust his body, making sleep possible that night despite the emptiness of the bed beside him. Tuesday morning, James was kneeling in the front yard, weeding the flower beds that had been neglected during the busy winter months when he heard a car pull into his driveway. He looked up to see Marcus stepping out of his SUV, carrying a tray with 2 coffee cups. "Thought you might need this," Marcus said, offering one of the cups to James. "Ellie called Vanessa last night." James accepted the coffee and stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "So you know." Marcus nodded, his expression serious but not pitying. "Some of it. Enough to know you could use a friend." James gestured toward the front porch, and they sat on the steps side by side, the spring sun warm on their faces despite the cool air. "How much did Vanessa tell you?" James asked, after taking a sip of the coffee. "Black, with 1 sugar. Exactly how he liked it." "That Rebecca asked for an open marriage, that there's another guy involved, and that you're not okay with it," Marcus summarized, "and that she's staying with Ellie while figuring things out." James nodded, relieved that the basic truth was already out there. "That's the gist of it. How are you holding up?" Marcus asked, studying his friend's face. "I've been better," James admitted, offering a weak smile. "But I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'm clear about where I stand." "That helps." Marcus nodded, understanding the importance of this clarity to someone like James. "Want to talk about it?" James took another sip of coffee, considering the question. Until now, the situation had existed solely between him and Rebecca, contained within the private sphere of their marriage. Discussing it with Marcus would make it more real somehow, would begin the process of their private crisis becoming known to their wider circle. But Marcus was looking at him with the same steady friendship he had offered for 20 years, and James found himself wanting to share the burden. "She says his name is David," he began, "the new vice principal at her school." James spent the next 2 hours on his front porch with Marcus, talking more openly than he had in years. He recounted Rebecca's ultimatum in detail, his own response, and the uncertain limbo they now occupied. Marcus listened attentively, asking occasional questions, but mostly providing the silent support of someone who understood the value of simply being present. "You know what's strange?" James said, staring into his now empty coffee cup. "I keep wondering if I missed something, if there were signs I should have seen." Marcus considered this. Maybe, maybe not. People are complicated, man. Sometimes they don't even understand their own motivations until they're already halfway. Down a path. I thought I knew her, James said quietly. After 12 years, I thought I knew who we were together. For what it's worth, Marcus offered, I think you're handling this with more grace than most people would. I'm not sure I could be so measured if I were in your position. James gave a humorless laugh. Trust me, I don't feel particularly graceful right now. I'm just trying to stay true to myself while everything falls apart. After Marcus left, promising to check in the following day, James found himself restless and unable to focus on the household projects that had occupied him earlier. His conversation with Marcus had stirred up questions that demanded answers, not about what would happen next, but about how they had arrived at this point. Had there been warning signs he'd missed? Moments when Rebecca had tried to communicate her dissatisfaction in ways he hadn't recognized? Or had this truly come from nowhere, a sudden deviation rather than a gradual drift? Almost without conscious decision, James found himself climbing the stairs to their bedroom. He hadn't slept there since Rebecca's revelation, choosing the guest room instead, but now he felt drawn to the space they had shared for so many years. The room was unnaturally tidy, the bed made with hospital corners, Rebecca's typically cluttered, nightstand cleared of its usual collection of half-read books and tubes of hand cream. She had clearly made an effort to organize before packing her suitcase, perhaps as a small gesture of consideration in the midst of the chaos she had created. James sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the quilt Rebecca's grandmother had given them as a wedding present. So many nights they had slept beneath it, sometimes wrapped in each other's arms, sometimes turned away, but still connected by the shared warmth and rhythm of their breathing. His gaze fell on Rebecca's dresser, where a small wooden box, one he had made for her their second Christmas together, held her jewelry. It stood open, suggesting she had sorted through its contents while packing. James crossed to it, noticing immediately that her wedding and engagement rings were missing. Had she taken them to Ellie's, or had she already stopped wearing them? As he moved to close the box, something caught his eye. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the corner beneath a tangle of necklaces. Curiosity overrode his usual respect for Rebecca's privacy, and he carefully extracted it. It was a note, handwritten in an unfamiliar script. Dinner was amazing. The way you looked in that dress made it hard to focus on the menu. I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't been interrupted. Tomorrow, 5 p.m., my place? No interruptions this time. D. James stared at the note, the blood rushing in his ears as its implications registered. Dinner, address, his place. This wasn't the note of someone pursuing a potential relationship. This was correspondence between people who had already crossed boundaries. With shaking hands, James refolded the paper and returned it to its hiding place. His mind raced, connecting dots that suddenly formed a clear and devastating picture. Rebecca's late nights at curriculum planning meetings, the new dress she had bought last month, which he had never seen her wear, the text messages she guarded so carefully, turning away from him whenever her phone chimed. The truth hit him with physical force. Rebecca hadn't just developed feelings for David. Their relationship had already progressed beyond attraction into something more concrete. She hadn't come to James with an honest request to explore new relationship dynamics. She had come seeking retroactive permission for a betrayal already in progress. James felt sick, his earlier grief now complicated by a surge of anger and humiliation. He had been operating under the assumption that Rebecca was being forthright about wanting to change their relationship moving forward. He had respected her honesty even as he rejected her proposal, but this note suggested there was nothing honest about her approach. He needed more information before confronting her. If his suspicion was correct, if Rebecca and David had already begun a physical relationship, it changed everything about their current situation. James returned downstairs, his mind working methodically despite the emotional turmoil. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop, navigating to their shared calendar. Rebecca had always been diligent about recording her work commitments, a habit from early in their marriage when coordinating schedules had been essential to maintaining quality time together. He scrolled back through the previous months, noting the increasing frequency of evening meetings labeled simply curriculum planning or administrative review. There was a pattern to them, typically on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always scheduled until 8 p.m., despite the fact that school staff rarely stayed that late. Next, James opened their shared cloud storage, looking for the folders where Rebecca typically kept copies of her work documents. He found plenty of actual curriculum plans and administrative paperwork, but nothing that would require the frequent late-night meetings she had been attending. Could he be overreacting, misinterpreting innocent professional development as something sinister? James wanted to believe it, wanted to give Rebecca the benefit of the doubt he had always extended throughout their marriage. But the note in her jewelry box was unambiguous. What might have happened if we hadn't been interrupted wasn't a line about professional collaboration or innocent friendship. Almost reluctantly, James opened their joint bank account records. Rebecca had her own personal account for her teaching salary, but they maintained a joint account for household expenses and shared savings. He scanned the recent transactions, looking for anything unusual. There it was, a charge from 3 weeks ago at Maison Bleue, an upscale French restaurant downtown that they had visited only for special occasions due to its expensive menu. The charge was for $187.43, a substantial amount for a dinner for two. James had been in Chicago that week for a conference. Rebecca had told him she was having dinner with colleagues from school. He continued scrolling, finding other suspicious charges. A $75 purchase at an upscale lingerie boutique, a $45 charge. At a wine shop on a day, James had been working late. Multiple Uber receipts for rides to an address in Brookline that he didn't recognize. The evidence mounted, each new discovery adding weight to the conclusion he could no longer avoid. Rebecca had been having an affair with David. Her request for an open marriage wasn't a preemptive discussion about changing their relationship. It was damage control, an attempt to legitimize a betrayal that had already occurred. James closed the laptop, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging within him. He had believed they were navigating an honest philosophical difference about monogamy and commitment. Now he realized they were dealing with something far more conventional and painful. Infidelity, deception, and the breaking of vows already, violated rather than merely renegotiated. The question now was what to do with this information. Confront Rebecca immediately, gather more evidence, consult with an attorney. Each option had merits and risks, and James needed time to consider his next move carefully. One thing was certain: his original offer and its condition remained unchanged. If anything, this new information strengthened his resolve. Rebecca could still choose between recommitting to their marriage or accepting divorce, but either way, the full truth would need to be acknowledged. James stood, suddenly unable to remain in the house that now felt filled with deception. He grabbed his keys and jacket, needing fresh air and movement to process this new layer of betrayal. As he drove aimlessly through the familiar streets of Millfield, James's mind returned to something his grandfather had told him years ago. The worst betrayals aren't the ones that come from enemies. They're the ones that come from those we trust completely. At the time, James hadn't fully understood the wisdom in those words. Now, with the foundation of his marriage crumbling beneath him, their truth resonated with painful clarity. When his phone rang, Marcus's name appearing on the car's display, James hesitated before answering. How much should he share of what he had discovered? Was he ready to speak the painful truth aloud, to make it real through acknowledgement? After 3 rings, he pressed the button on his steering wheel. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "James." Marcus sounded concerned. "You okay, man? You sound off." James took a deep breath, then made a decision. If he expected complete honesty from Rebecca, he needed to be equally truthful with his own support system. "No," he admitted, pulling into the parking lot of a local park where he and Rebecca had often walked on Sunday afternoons. "I'm not okay. I just found evidence that Rebecca's been having an affair with this David guy. It's not just about wanting an open marriage going forward. She's already been cheating." The words hung in the air, their weight both crushing and somehow liberating. By speaking them aloud, James had taken the first step toward facing a reality far more painful than the one he had been grappling with for the past 3 days. And as the full implications of Rebecca's deception sank in, James realized that the path forward had just become simultaneously clearer and infinitely more difficult. "I'm coming over," Marcus said immediately after James shared his discovery. "You shouldn't be alone right now." James's first instinct was to refuse, to insist he was fine handling this by himself. But the events of the past few days had taught him that isolation only amplified pain. "Thanks," he said instead. "I'm at Riverside Park. I'll head home now." 20 minutes later, Marcus's SUV pulled into James's driveway, just as James was walking up the front path. The 2 men embraced without words, a brief but firm hug that conveyed more support than any verbal reassurance could have. Inside, James showed Marcus the evidence he'd gathered, the bank statements, the calendar entries, the note he'd found. Marcus examined it all with growing indignation on his friend's behalf. "This changes everything," he said finally, pushing away from the kitchen table where they'd spread out the documents. She wasn't being honest about wanting to explore an open relationship. She was trying to retroactively justify cheating. James nodded, a dull ache spreading through his chest as Marcus articulated the painful conclusion he'd already reached. "I keep thinking about those therapy sessions," he said quietly. "Were they even real, or was she just trying to ease her conscience?" Marcus shook his head. "Man, I don't know. But what I do know is you need more support than just me right now." He hesitated before continuing. "Have you thought about talking to Frank? He's been through something similar, right?" James hadn't considered this, but Marcus was right. Frank's first wife had left him for another man decades ago, before he met Grace. Though Frank rarely spoke of that period, James knew it had been a formative experience in his mentor's life. "That's actually a good idea," James admitted. "Frank has perspective I could use right now." "And what about legal advice?" Marcus pressed. "I know we're friends with Ellie, but she's Rebecca's best friend. You need someone looking out specifically for your interests." The suggestion of lawyers made the situation suddenly more real, more final. Until now, James had been operating as if reconciliation was still possible, difficult but achievable if Rebecca chose that path. But the evidence of her ongoing deception shifted something fundamental in his perspective. "You're right," he acknowledged. "This isn't just about emotional betrayal anymore. We have joint finances, property, retirement accounts." Marcus nodded. "My cousin Natalie is a divorce attorney in Boston. She's straightforward and really good at her job. I could put you in touch." James ran a hand through his hair, feeling overwhelmed by the rapid escalation, but knowing these steps were necessary. "Okay, set it up." "What about your sister?" Marcus asked. "Have you told Catherine what's happening?" James shook his head. "Not yet. I've been trying to process it myself first." "Call her," Marcus urged. "Catherine adores you. She'd want to know." That evening, after Marcus left with promises to arrange a meeting with his cousin Natalie, James found himself alone. Again. The house felt different now, not just empty of Rebecca's presence, but somehow tainted by the knowledge of her deception. Spaces that had once held comfort now bristled with painful questions. How many times had she texted David from the sofa? Where they watched movies together? Had she planned their encounters while preparing dinner in their kitchen? Had she lied about work commitments while James waited up for her, worried and supportive? James picked up his phone and called Frank. Despite the late hour, his mentor answered on the third ring. "James? Everything all right?" Frank's voice was alert despite the hour, concern evident in his tone. "No," James admitted. "I'm sorry to call. So late, but I could use some wisdom." "I'm listening," Frank said simply. James explained the situation, Rebecca's request for an open marriage, his discovery of her affair with David, the evidence he'd found. Frank listened without interruption, making only occasional sounds of acknowledgement to indicate he was still there. When James finished, Frank was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry you're going through this," he said finally. "It's a particular kind of pain discovering the person you trusted most has been living a double life." "How did you get through it?" James asked. "When Elizabeth left you?" Frank sighed, the sound carrying decades of processed grief. "Not particularly well at first," he admitted. "I made some classic mistakes. Begged her to stay, tried to pretend it wasn't happening, then swung to blind anger that accomplished nothing. But eventually I figured out that the only path forward was through acceptance and self-respect." "Self-respect," James repeated, the word resonating deeply. "Yes. When someone betrays you this fundamentally, you have two choices. You can compromise your dignity to keep them in your life, or you can honor yourself by refusing to accept less than you deserve. The first path might seem easier in the moment, but it costs you something essential in the long run." The wisdom in Frank's words struck James with particular force because they echoed his own instinctive response to Rebecca's initial request. He had refused to compromise his principles about marriage even before discovering the affair. "What would you do in my position now?" James asked. "Knowing what you know from experience?" "I'd prepare for the likelihood that your marriage is over," Frank said bluntly but kindly. "Not because reconciliation is impossible in all cases of infidelity, but because Rebecca's actions show a pattern of deception that's particularly difficult to come back from. She didn't confess in a moment of remorse. She tried to manipulate you into accepting an arrangement that would allow her affair to continue with your blessing." James absorbed this assessment, recognizing its truth even as it pained him. "Get good legal advice," Frank continued. "Document everything. Be prepared for the possibility that Rebecca may try to control the narrative when others learn about what's happened. And most importantly, remember that surviving this with your integrity intact is more important than saving a marriage that exists only in memory now." After hanging up, James called Catherine despite the 3-hour time difference. His sister answered groggily but became fully alert as he explained the situation. "I'm booking a flight," she said immediately. "The kids can stay with Michael's parents for a few days." "Kath, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted firmly. "You've always been there for me, James. Let me be there for you now." By the time James ended the call, he had the beginnings of a support system in place. Marcus providing local friendship and practical help, Frank offering wisdom from experience, Catherine preparing to fly in from Seattle, and a meeting scheduled. With Natalie, Marcus's cousin, for legal guidance. It wasn't the network he would have chosen or the circumstances he would have wanted. But as James finally lay down to sleep that night, he felt less alone than he had in the days since Rebecca's revelation. Whatever came next, confrontation, divorce, the painful unraveling of 12 years of shared life, he would face it surrounded by people who valued him for exactly who he was, and in the midst of betrayal, that certainty provided a foundation he could build upon. James woke early the next morning, his mind already active with plans and considerations despite his fitful sleep. The initial shock of discovering Rebecca's affair had evolved into a clear-eyed determination to navigate the situation with both intelligence and integrity. Catherine had texted that she'd booked a flight arriving that afternoon. Marcus had confirmed a meeting with his cousin Natalie for 11 a.m. The day would be full, requiring James to focus on practical matters rather than dwelling on his emotional pain. After a quick shower and strong coffee, James sat at his desk with a notebook, organizing his thoughts. He needed a comprehensive strategy, not just for handling the legal aspects of a potential divorce, but for managing the inevitable conversations with Rebecca, their families, friends, and colleagues. His phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. "Can we talk today? I've been doing a lot of thinking." James stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. After a moment's consideration, he replied, "I have meetings today. Tomorrow would be better. My house, 7 p.m. The response came quickly. "Okay, thank you." The formal, distant tone of their exchange struck James as both appropriate and surreal. How quickly 12 years of intimacy had dissolved into the cautious communication of near strangers. At 10:45, Marcus arrived to drive James to the meeting with Natalie. "You ready for this?" he asked as James climbed into the passenger seat. "As ready as I can be," James replied, grateful for his friend's steady presence. Natalie Porter's office was located in a converted Victorian house near the courthouse, its interior modernized with sleek furnishings while maintaining the original architectural details. The attorney herself was a woman in her early 40s with a direct gaze and efficient manner that James immediately appreciated. After Marcus made introductions and excused himself to wait in the reception area, Natalie got straight to business. "Marcus gave me a brief overview of your situation," she said, gesturing for James to take a seat across from her desk. "But I'd like to hear it from you, particularly the timeline of events and what evidence you've discovered." James recounted the past week in detail, Rebecca's request for an open marriage, his response and condition, her temporary move to Ellie's, and his subsequent discovery of the affair. He showed Natalie the photos he'd taken of the bank statements, the note from David, and the calendar entries. Natalie listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When James finished, she sat back in her chair, considering. "First, I want to say that your approach so far has been remarkably measured, given the circumstances," she said. "Many clients in your position have already made impulsive decisions that complicate matters legally." "I'm trying to be deliberate," James said. "I don't want emotions to drive choices I'll regret later." Natalie nodded approvingly. "That's wise, so let's talk strategy. Based on what you've told me, you're still open to reconciliation if Rebecca recommits to monogamy, but you're preparing for divorce if she chooses to continue her relationship with David. Is that correct?" "Yes," James confirmed, though after discovering the affair, reconciliation would require significant work beyond just her recommitment to monogamy. There's a fundamental breach of trust that would need to be addressed. "Understood," Natalie said. "In either scenario, my advice is to protect yourself legally. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst." She opened a folder on her desk, pulling out several documents. Massachusetts is a no-fault divorce state, so her infidelity isn't technically relevant to the legal proceedings. However, it may influence negotiations regarding property division, especially if she's spent marital assets on the affair. James nodded, taking in the information. "What should my immediate priorities be?" "First, document everything," Natalie said firmly. "Continue keeping records of any evidence of the affair, especially financial. Second, I recommend securing your finances without completely disrupting them. Open a separate account for your and personal income going forward. but don't drain joint accounts or make large transfers that could be seen as financial manipulation. She slid a document across the desk. This is a financial disclosure form. Start filling it out. List all assets, debts, income sources, and regular expenses. The more comprehensive you can be, the better. James took the form, scanning its pages. Of detailed questions about property, investments, retirement accounts, and liabilities. What about tomorrow's conversation with Rebecca? He asked. How much should I reveal about what I know? Natalie considered the question carefully. That depends on your ultimate goal. If reconciliation is still on the table, complete transparency about what you've discovered might be appropriate, though it will undoubtedly be painful for both of you. She leaned forward slightly. But if you're leaning toward divorce, there's a strategic advantage to holding back some information, not in a manipulative way, but to prevent her from creating alternative explanations or disposing of additional evidence you haven't yet discovered. I hadn't thought of that, James admitted. Most people don't, Natalie said with a small smile. They assume that emotional confrontations lead to clarity, when often they just create more confusion and conflict. My suggestion would be to acknowledge that you know about the affair, but be vague about how much evidence you have. See how she responds before showing your full hand. The advice made sense, aligning with James's natural inclination toward measured responses rather than dramatic confrontations. One more thing, Natalie added. You mentioned your condition about honesty regarding the reasons for divorce. While I appreciate the principle behind it, be prepared for Rebecca to push back strongly. People rarely want their infidelity widely known, especially when it affects their professional reputation. James nodded. I understand, but I won't agree to a false narrative about our marriage ending. I can be discreet without being dishonest. Fair enough, Natalie said. Just be aware that this stance may complicate negotiations. When the meeting concluded an hour later, James felt more grounded. He had a clearer understanding of the legal landscape and practical steps to take, regardless of Rebecca's decision. Marcus was waiting in the reception area, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as James approached. How'd it go? Well, James said. Natalie's exactly what I needed, straightforward and practical. She's the best, Marcus agreed as they walked to the car. So what's next? Catherine arrives at 3, James replied. Then tomorrow I talked to Rebecca. On the drive back to James's house, they discussed practical matters, what documents James should gather, how to secure digital accounts and passwords, whether to consult a financial advisor about retirement funds and investments. You know what's strange? James said, as they pulled into his driveway. A week ago, I was thinking about building a fire pit in the backyard for summer gatherings. Now I'm planning how to potentially dismantle 12 years of marriage. Marcus gripped his friend's shoulder. Life changes fast sometimes, but you'll get through this, whatever happens. Catherine's arrival that afternoon brought a different energy to the house. Unlike Marcus's quiet, steady support or Natalie's professional guidance, Catherine brought the fierce loyalty and emotional understanding that only a sibling could provide. This is completely messed up, she declared after James had updated her on the latest developments. They sat at the kitchen table, where she had spread out take-out containers from James's favorite Thai restaurant. I always thought Rebecca was better than this. So did I, James said simply. Catherine studied her brother's face. You're holding it together surprisingly well, James shrugged. Not much choice. Falling apart won't solve anything. True, Catherine acknowledged, but don't confuse being strong with not feeling. It's okay to be angry, hurt, all of it. Oh, I'm feeling everything, James assured her. I'm just trying to channel it productively. Together they spent the evening preparing for James's conversation with Rebecca. Catherine, with her teacher's organizational skill, helped him create an outline of key points to address and questions to ask. They anticipated Rebecca's likely responses and how James might handle each scenario. The most important thing, Catherine advised, is to stay focused on your core principles. Don't let her redirect the conversation away from her actions or manipulate you emotionally. James nodded, grateful for his sister's clear-eyed perspective. I won't. As they finished their planning session, Catherine looked around the living room, at the photos of James and Rebecca through the years, the furniture they had chosen together, the small touches that reflected their shared life. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said gently, remember that you deserve someone who chooses you completely, not conditionally, someone who respects the vows they made. James felt tears threaten for the first time that day. I know, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But right now it's hard to imagine that future. Catherine squeezed his hand. It exists. Trust me. And after all this is settled, I'll help you find it. As James lay in bed that night, he reviewed the strategy he had developed with input from Marcus, Natalie, Frank, and Catherine. He felt as prepared as possible for the conversation with Rebecca, though he knew that no amount of planning could fully shield him from the emotional impact of confronting his wife about her betrayal. His last thought before falling asleep was a quiet acknowledgement to himself. Regardless of Rebecca's decision tomorrow, his life had already fundamentally changed. The innocence and trust that had characterized their marriage could never be fully restored. The only question now was whether they would attempt to build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed, or whether they would walk separate paths forward. Either way, James was committed to facing the future with the same integrity and courage that had guided him through the past week of revelations and difficult choices. At precisely 6:55 p.m. the following evening, Rebecca's car pulled into the driveway. James watched from the living room window as she sat for a moment, seemingly gathering herself before exiting the vehicle. She looked tired, he noted, with dark circles under her eyes visible even from a distance. She wore a blue sweater he had given her last Christmas and carried a small bag that suggested she wasn't planning to stay. Catherine had left an hour earlier, after helping James prepare the living room. They had removed most of the personal photos, creating a more neutral space for the difficult conversation ahead. She had hugged him tightly before departing for her hotel room, making him promise to call regardless of the outcome. James opened the door before Rebecca could knock, standing aside to let her enter. The familiarity of her presence in their home, the scent of her perfume, the sound of her footsteps on the hardwood floor, created a surreal contrast with the emotional distance between them. "Thank you for agreeing to talk," Rebecca said, her voice carefully neutral as she took a seat on the couch. James sat in the armchair across from her, deliberately choosing not to join her on the sofa where they would normally sit together. "I think we have a lot to discuss," he replied, his tone equally measured. Rebecca nodded, fidgeting slightly with the strap of her purse. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation, about what I want, about us, about the future." James studied her face, looking for signs of the Rebecca he had known, the woman who had once been incapable of hiding her emotions from him, but her expression remained guarded, rehearsed. "Before you share your thoughts," James said calmly, "there's something I need to address." Rebecca stilled, wariness entering her eyes. "What is it?" James took a deep breath, centering himself for what came next. "I know about the affair, Rebecca. I know you and David have already been involved. Physically, your request for an open marriage wasn't about exploring new relationship dynamics. It was about legitimizing a relationship that was already happening behind my back." The color drained from Rebecca's face, her composure cracking visibly. How did you—" "It doesn't matter how I know," James interrupted, following Natalie's advice to be vague about his evidence. "What matters is that you weren't honest with me. You presented your request as a philosophical choice about relationship structures, when in reality you were trying to retroactively obtain permission for cheating. Rebecca looked down at her hands, which were now trembling slightly. It's not that simple, she said, echoing her words from their previous conversations. Then explain it to me, James challenged, leaning forward slightly. Help me understand what part of having an affair while married isn't a straightforward betrayal. Rebecca's eyes flashed with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. You want the truth? Fine. Yes, David and I have been seeing each other. It started as a friendship, but it evolved into something more about 2 months ago. 2 months, James repeated, the timeline confirming his suspicions about her increased work commitments during that period. I never meant for it to happen, Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into what sounded like a prepared explanation. David and I were working late on the curriculum revisions. We got dinner because we were both starving. The conversation turned personal. He understood things about me, about my ambitions and desires, in a way that felt, she hesitated, searching for the right word, revelatory. James kept his expression neutral, despite the pain her words caused. And that justified betraying our marriage vows? No, Rebecca admitted, surprising him slightly. It didn't. I know that. I got caught up in the excitement, the newness of it. David made me feel alive in ways I hadn't in years. The implication that their marriage had been somehow deadening stung, but James focused on maintaining his composure. So instead of talking to me about your feelings, instead of suggesting counseling or even considering separation, you chose to lie and cheat. Rebecca flinched at the directness of his words. I was confused. I still loved you, still valued our life together. I didn't want to throw everything away based on feelings that might be temporary, but the more time I spent with David, the more I realized I couldn't just end things with him either. So your solution was to try to have both, James observed, his voice even despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. I thought an open marriage could be a way for me to explore this connection without losing you, Rebecca said, meeting his eyes for the first time since her confession. I know now. That was unfair and probably naive. Unfair and naive, James repeated. That's quite an understatement for lying to my face for months, sneaking around behind my back, and then trying to manipulate me into accepting an arrangement that would let you continue your affair with my blessing. Rebecca winced but didn't dispute his characterization. I made mistakes, serious ones. I can see that now. And where does that leave us? James asked, bringing the conversation back to the choice he had presented her with initially. Rebecca took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders slightly. I've decided I want to try to save our marriage, if you're still willing to consider it after what I've done. James hadn't expected this response. He had prepared himself for Rebecca to choose divorce, to prioritize her relationship with David over their marriage. Her apparent willingness to recommit caught him off guard. You want to stay married, he said slowly, studying her face for signs of deception or manipulation. What about David? I ended things with him yesterday, Rebecca said, reaching into her purse and pulling out her phone. I can show you the text conversation if you want proof. James shook his head. That won't be necessary right now. What made you decide to end the affair? Rebecca looked down again. These days apart gave me perspective. I realized what I was risking. 12 years with a good man who has always supported me, always been there for me, for something that might be nothing more than infatuation. And your response, your unwillingness to compromise your principles, it made me see things differently. Differently how? James pressed, needing to understand her reasoning before considering her request. I've always admired your integrity. James, it's one of the things that drew me to you in the first place. When you refused to accept an open marriage, when you were willing to lose me rather than compromise your values, It forced me to question my own choices. If our positions were reversed, would I have shown the same strength of character? Her answer seemed genuine, but James remained cautious. And now you believe you can recommit to monogamy? That you can be faithful after betraying that promise once already? I believe I can, Rebecca said, her voice stronger now. I know it won't be easy. I know rebuilding trust will take time. But yes, I want to try. James was silent for a long moment, processing her words and searching his own heart. Part of him, the part that had loved Rebecca for 12 years, that had built a life with her, wanted to seize this opportunity for reconciliation. But another part recognized the magnitude of her betrayal and questioned whether their marriage could ever fully recover. If we were to try, he said finally, there would need to be complete transparency about the affair, about your relationship with David, about what led you to make these choices. No more lies, no more half-truths. Rebecca nodded quickly. Of course, I'll tell you everything you want to know. And we would need serious counseling, James continued, not just a few sessions like before, but committed long-term work on rebuilding what's been broken. I agree, Rebecca said. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. James studied her, noting the apparent sincerity in her expression, but remembering how convincingly she had lied to him for months. There's something else you need to understand, Rebecca. I haven't decided yet whether I can move forward with you after what's happened. I need time to process everything and determine if rebuilding is even possible. Rebecca's face fell slightly, but she nodded. I understand. I know I have no right to expect immediate forgiveness, or even a second chance at all. No, you don't, James confirmed, his tone not unkind but firm. Trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. It requires not just promises but consistent actions over time. And I'm not sure yet if I'm willing to invest that time and emotional energy. What can I do? Rebecca asked, leaning forward. To show you I'm serious about making this work? James considered the question carefully. For now, answer my questions. Honestly, help me understand how we got here and what I can expect if we try to move forward. For the next 2 hours, they talked with a level of candor that had been absent from their relationship for months. Rebecca answered James's questions about the affair, how it started, how long it had been physical, what she had told David about in their marriage. She admitted to using their joint account for dinners and hotel stays with him, confirmed that the therapy sessions had been genuine but insufficient, and acknowledged the selfishness of her actions. Throughout the painful conversation, James maintained his composure, asking questions without accusation, but also without flinching from difficult truths. By the time Rebecca left, they had reached no definitive resolution about their future together, but they had established a foundation of honesty that had been missing since her affair began. As James closed the door behind her, he felt emotionally drained, but also strangely peaceful. Whatever decision he ultimately made about their marriage, it would be based on truth rather than illusion, on seeing Rebecca as she actually was, not as he had imagined her to be. And in a situation filled with pain and uncertainty, that clarity felt like the beginning of wisdom. After Rebecca left, James called Catherine to update her on their conversation. She listened attentively as he recounted Rebecca's admission of the affair, her claim to have ended things with David, and her expressed desire to save their marriage. "Do you believe her?" Catherine asked when he finished. "About wanting to recommit to the marriage?" James considered the question carefully. "I think she believes it right now," he said finally, "but I'm not convinced it's what she'll want long-term. This kind of sudden reversal feels reactive rather than deeply considered. What are you going to do?" "I need more information before I decide," James replied. "Rebecca offered transparency, and I intend to hold her to that, but I also need to Verify things independently. Trust but verify, as they say. The following morning, James met with Natalie again, sharing the details of his conversation with Rebecca. The attorney listened thoughtfully, making occasional notes. Her desire to reconcile changes the immediate legal strategy, Natalie observed when he finished. But it doesn't eliminate the need for you to protect yourself. If anything, it makes certain precautions even more important. What do you suggest? James asked. First, I recommend a post-nuptial agreement, Natalie said decisively. If you decide to continue the marriage, this document would outline financial consequences should future infidelity occur. She slid a sample document across her desk. This creates accountability beyond verbal promises. It shows you're willing to work on the marriage, but not without protections in place. James scanned the document, noting clauses about division of assets, potential alimony waivers, and specific terms related to infidelity. It felt strange, reducing the emotional complexity of marriage to legal stipulations, but he understood the practicality of Natalie's suggestion. Second, Natalie continued, I advise documenting the current state of all finances. Even if reconciliation is the goal, having a clear record of assets, debts, and expenditures at this moment creates a baseline that protects both parties. And if reconciliation fails, James asked, then you're already prepared for what comes next, Natalie said simply. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Back at home, James followed Natalie's advice, meticulously documenting their financial situation. He created spreadsheets listing their joint and individual accounts, retirement funds, property values, outstanding debts, and recent expenditures. The process was tedious but grounding, giving him a concrete task to focus on while processing the emotional aspects of his situation. While working through their investment accounts, James discovered something unexpected, a withdrawal of $8,000 from their joint savings 2 weeks ago, an amount Rebecca hadn't mentioned during their conversation about the affair. There was no corresponding deposit in their checking account or credit card payment that would explain such a large sum. James noted this discrepancy without jumping to conclusions. It could have an innocent explanation, but given recent events, it warranted further investigation. Later that afternoon, he met Marcus for coffee at a local cafe, away from both their homes, where they could speak freely without concern about being overheard. So she wants to save the marriage, Marcus said after James updated him. Didn't see that coming. Me neither, James admitted. I was prepared for her to choose divorce. Do you want to reconcile? Marcus asked directly, studying his friend's face. James sighed, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. I don't know. Part of me still loves her. 12 years doesn't just disappear. But another part wonders if what I loved was an illusion. The Rebecca I thought I knew wouldn't have cheated and lied for months. People are complicated, Marcus said, echoing his words from days earlier. Sometimes they're multiple versions of themselves at once. The question is, which version is the real Rebecca? James replied. The devoted wife of 10 years, or the woman who betrayed our marriage so easily? And can I ever trust her enough to be vulnerable with her again? Marcus nodded understandingly. No easy answers there, but you don't have to decide everything immediately. That's what Frank said too, James agreed. Take time, gather information, make decisions with clarity rather than emotion. Speaking of gathering information, Marcus said, lowering his voice slightly, have you considered looking more deeply into this David guy? Might help to know exactly who you're dealing with. James had considered this but felt uncertain about the ethics of investigating someone he'd never met. What are you suggesting? Nothing extreme, Marcus assured him. Just some basic online research, LinkedIn, social media, that sort of thing. Get a sense of who he is beyond the guy who had an affair with my wife. The suggestion made practical sense. If James was considering reconciliation with Rebecca while she continued working at the same school as David, understanding the man's character and background seemed prudent. That evening, with Catherine's help, James conducted careful research. On David Brennan, vice principal of Millfield High School, LinkedIn revealed that he had been hired just 6 months ago after working in the Boston public school system. Before that, he had been an English teacher at a private school in Connecticut for 3 years. His work history showed frequent job changes, never staying in one position longer than 3 years. This pattern caught James's attention, raising questions about why someone would move so often in a field where stability was typically valued. Facebook and Instagram accounts were set to private, but the limited public information showed David to be in his late 30s, athletic and fond of posting inspirational quotes about living authentically and following your passion. Several photos showed him participating in marathons and triathlons. Catherine, who had developed impressive internet research skills through her work with at-risk students, found more concerning information. A local news article from Connecticut mentioned a David Brennan, 35, English teacher, who had resigned from Westlake Academy amid unspecified allegations. The article was brief and vague, noting only that the school had declined to comment on personnel matters. This could be something or nothing, Catherine cautioned as they read the article together. But the timing matches his LinkedIn transition from Connecticut to Boston. James nodded, taking careful notes. It's worth following up on. At minimum, it suggests a pattern of poor judgment that extends beyond his involvement with Rebecca. Further, searching revealed that David had been married briefly in his 20s. His ex-wife, Jennifer Keller, now worked as a clinical psychologist in Hartford and maintained a professional website with contact information. "I'm not suggesting you call her," Catherine said as James jotted down the information. "But if you decide reconciliation is impossible and Rebecca continues seeing David, having this context might be important." "It's not about revenge," James clarified, sensing his sister's concern. "It's about understanding the full picture before making decisions that will affect the rest of my life." The following day, James took another step toward strengthening his position. Following Natalie's advice, he visited their bank and opened a new individual account, then arranged for his salary to be deposited there rather than their joint account. He transferred half of their emergency fund to this new account while leaving the other half in the joint account, a balanced approach that protected his interests without emptying their shared resources. He also contacted their financial advisor, scheduling a confidential consultation to discuss options for their retirement accounts and investments. The conversation was uncomfortable, explaining that his marriage was in crisis without divulging all the details, but necessary to understand his options before making any final decisions about reconciliation. Between these practical steps, James continued processing his emotions about Rebecca's betrayal. He journaled extensively, documenting not just the facts of what had happened, but his feelings about each revelation. The practice helped him identify patterns in his own reactions and clarify what he truly wanted moving forward. Frank called daily, offering brief check-ins that provided both support and perspective. During one such call, he shared wisdom that particularly resonated with James. "The greatest leverage in any challenging situation isn't what you know about the other person," Frank said. "It's what you know about yourself, your values, your boundaries, what you're willing to accept and what you aren't. When you're clear about those things, other people's actions lose their power to control your responses." As James prepared for his next conversation with Rebecca, scheduled for the following evening, he reflected on Frank's words. Beyond the financial protections he had put in place, beyond the information he had gathered about David, his greatest strength lay in his own clarity about what marriage meant to him, about the kind of relationship he deserved. and about his unwillingness to compromise those principles for anyone, even the woman he had loved for 12 years. That certainty, more than any external leverage, would guide his path forward. For their second meeting, James suggested neutral territory, a private room at a small restaurant downtown that offered discreet spaces for business meetings and personal conversations. The setting provided both privacy and boundaries, preventing their discussion from becoming too comfortable or too volatile. Rebecca arrived precisely on time, dressed in a conservative navy dress that James recognized from family gatherings with her parents. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup minimal, choices that suggested she was approaching this meeting with seriousness rather than attempting to use their physical connection to influence the conversation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet again," she said, as she took her seat across from him at the small table. A single candle provided subtle lighting, illuminating their faces without creating an inappropriately romantic atmosphere. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation," James began, his voice steady, "about what happened, about your desire to reconcile, and about what that might look like if we decided to try." Rebecca nodded, her expression attentive. "I have too. I've started individual therapy, just 2 sessions so far, but it's already helping me understand why I made such destructive choices." James acknowledged this with a slight nod, but didn't allow it to divert him from his prepared points. "Before we discuss the possibility of reconciliation, there's something I need to ask you about." He removed a printed bank statement from a folder he had brought. 2 weeks ago, $8,000 was withdrawn from our joint savings account. Can you explain that?" Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, a flash of surprise quickly contained. Yes, I can explain that." She took a deep breath. "I lent the money to David. He was having financial problems and needed help with legal fees related to his divorce." "I see," James said calmly, though internally he noted that this was yet another deception she had maintained during their supposedly honest conversation. "And you didn't think to mention this when we discussed the financial aspects of your affair?" "I should have," Rebecca admitted, her gaze dropping to the table. "I was afraid it would make things worse, make you less likely to consider working on our marriage. What it does," James said evenly, "is demonstrate that you're still not being completely transparent with me, even while claiming to want reconciliation." Rebecca looked genuinely distressed. "You're right, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned it. Is David going to repay that money?" James asked. "He said he would once his divorce is finalized," Rebecca replied, though her tone suggested uncertainty. James made a mental note to consider this $8,000 effectively lost. "Are there any other financial transactions or aspects of your relationship with David that you haven't disclosed?" Rebecca hesitated just long enough for James to know the answer before she spoke. I paid for a hotel room 3 times, and I bought some new clothes specifically for seeing him. Nothing as substantial as the loan, but still marital assets spent on the affair," James finished for her. "Anything else?" She shook her head. "No, that's everything." James studied her face, trying to determine if she was being honest now or still withholding information. Deciding to move forward regardless, he opened his folder again. "If we were to attempt reconciliation," he said, removing several documents, "these would be my non-negotiable conditions." He placed the papers between them. "First, a post-nuptial agreement that clearly outlines financial consequences should either of us engage in infidelity in the future. My attorney has drafted this. You should have your own attorney review it before signing." Rebecca looked startled, but nodded slowly. "Second, complete transparency," James continued. "Access to each other's phones, email accounts, and schedules. I never wanted a marriage with surveillance, but you've broken the trust that made privacy possible." "I understand," Rebecca said quietly. "Third, you would need to find employment at a different school. Continuing to work with David is not compatible with rebuilding our marriage. This condition clearly surprised Rebecca, but the school year is already underway. Finding a new teaching position now would be nearly impossible. I'm not suggesting you quit immediately, James clarified, but you would need to commit to finding a new position for the next academic year, and in the meantime, maintain strictly professional, minimal contact with David. Rebecca seemed to be weighing this requirement, perhaps calculating its impact on her career against her stated desire to save their marriage. Fourth, James continued before she could respond, we would commit to both individual and couples therapy for a minimum of 1 year. Not occasional sessions when things get difficult, but consistent weekly appointments regardless of how we're feeling. I agree with that completely, Rebecca said, appearing genuinely supportive of this condition. And finally, James said, his gaze steady as he delivered the most challenging requirement, full disclosure to our immediate families about why we've been separated and what we're working through. Not public announcements or social media posts, but honest conversations with our parents and siblings. Rebecca's face paled visibly. You want me to tell my parents I had an affair? Yes, James said simply. Reconciliation can't be built on secrets and shame. If we're going to try to rebuild, it needs to be in the light, with accountability and support from the people closest to us. He watched as Rebecca processed these conditions, her expression shifting through various emotions: shock, resistance, consideration, and finally, a kind of resigned acceptance. These aren't punishments, James explained, his tone softening slightly. They're boundaries that would make it possible for me to consider trusting you again. Without them, I don't see how we move forward. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the post-nuptial agreement. And if I agree to all of this, she finally asked, does that mean you'll definitely try to save our marriage? James had anticipated this question. No, he said honestly. It means I'll be open to the possibility. I can't promise more than that right now. The decision to betray our marriage was made unilaterally by you. The decision to try to rebuild it needs to be made by both of us, with clear eyes about what that entails. Their eyes met across the table, the weight of 12 years and an uncertain future hanging between them. In that moment, James saw something shift in Rebecca's expression, perhaps the first genuine recognition of the consequences of her choices, beyond the immediate emotional drama. I need time to think about this, she said finally. James nodded, gathering the documents and returning them to his folder. Take whatever time you need, but understand that my conditions aren't flexible. This is what I require to even consider reconciliation. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca hesitated, then asked quietly, do you think you could ever truly forgive me, James, even with all these conditions met? James considered the question carefully, owing her the honesty he was demanding from her. I don't know, he admitted, but I do know that without truth, transparency, and genuine accountability, forgiveness isn't even possible. The days following James's presentation of his conditions passed in a strange calm. He had placed the ball firmly in Rebecca's court, and now all he could do was wait for her response. This limbo state, while uncertain, felt different from the chaotic emotional turbulence of the previous weeks. James had done what he could to establish clear boundaries and protect himself. The rest was out of his control. Catherine extended her stay in Millfield, working remotely from James's guest room so he wouldn't be alone with his thoughts. Her presence provided both practical support and emotional ballast as he navigated this period of waiting. Whatever she decides, Catherine told him over breakfast 3 days after his meeting with Rebecca, you've handled this with incredible dignity. I'm proud of you. James managed a small smile. Thanks. Some moments I feel strong and clear about my path forward. Other times I catch myself hoping she'll meet all my conditions so we can try again. That's natural, Catherine assured him. 12 years is a long time to build a life with someone. Those feelings don't disappear overnight, even after betrayal. Later that morning, James received a text from Rebecca. I've thought about your conditions. Can we meet tomorrow at 7, same place? James confirmed the arrangement, then called Natalie to update her and seek advice about the potential meeting. The attorney suggested he bring 2 copies of the post-nuptial agreement, in case Rebecca decided to accept his terms. Remember, Natalie cautioned, this document is just the beginning of establishing boundaries. If she signs it, advise her to have her own attorney review it before finalizing. This protects both of you by ensuring she can't later claim she didn't understand what she was agreeing to. That evening, Frank called to check in. How are you holding up? The older man asked, his voice conveying genuine concern. Surprisingly steady, James replied. I keep expecting to feel more anxiety about tomorrow's meeting, but mostly I feel prepared. That's what clarity does, Frank observed. When you know your own mind and have established firm boundaries, other people's decisions lose their power to destabilize you. The wisdom in Frank's words resonated deeply. James realized that regardless of Rebecca's choice tomorrow, he had already achieved something vital, a renewed confidence in his own judgment and values. As he prepared for bed that night, James found himself thinking not about Rebecca or their marriage, but about the future stretching before him. If she accepted his conditions, they would begin the long, difficult work of rebuilding trust. If she rejected them, he would move forward alone, eventually filing for divorce and starting a new chapter. Either way, he would be guided by the same principles that had sustained him through this crisis: honesty, integrity, and an unwillingness to compromise on the values that defined him. Morning brought a surprising sense of peace. James dressed carefully for work, knowing he would go directly to the restaurant from his office. Catherine hugged him before he left, reminding him that she was just a phone call away if he needed support after the meeting. Remember, she said, you've already done the hardest part by establishing your boundaries. Now you just need to hold them, whatever she decides. James nodded, grateful for his sister's unwavering support. As he drove to work, he reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. When Rebecca had first presented her ultimatum about an open marriage, he had been shocked and disoriented, struggling to process her request. Now, having faced the full truth of her betrayal, he felt strangely empowered. The vulnerability that had once defined their marriage had been replaced by something more measured and deliberate. James wasn't sure if this new relationship, whether it continued as a marriage or transitioned to a divorce, was better or worse than what had come before. But he was certain it was more honest, and that knowledge alone provided a foundation he could build upon. James arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early, bringing with him the folder containing 2 copies of the post-nuptial agreement and other relevant documents. The maître d' recognized him from their previous meeting and led him to the same private room where he had presented his conditions to Rebecca. He had just settled into his seat when she entered, wearing a simple black dress and carrying a small portfolio. Her expression was composed but solemn, giving no immediate indication of her decision. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, taking the seat across from him. James nodded. "You've had time to consider my conditions?" "Yes," Rebecca said, meeting his gaze directly. "I have." She opened her portfolio and removed several sheets of paper. "I want to be clear that I understand the gravity of what I've done and the damage I've caused to our marriage." Her voice was steady, rehearsed, but seemingly sincere. "I've thought very carefully about each of your conditions." James remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "The post-nuptial agreement," Rebecca said, gesturing to his folder. "I'm willing to sign it, though I would like my attorney to review it first, as you suggested." She moved to the next item on her mental list. "Complete transparency, yes. I understand why that's necessary, and I accept it without reservation." James nodded slightly, surprised by her ready agreement, but maintaining his composure. "Regarding changing schools," Rebecca continued, "I've already spoken to a former colleague who now works as a department chair at Riverside High. She believes there will be an opening next fall, and she's willing to recommend me." This proactive step caught James off guard. He hadn't expected Rebecca to have already explored specific options. "As for therapy, I've had 3 sessions now with Dr. Winters, and she's recommended a couples therapist who specializes in rebuilding after infidelity. I have her information here." Rebecca slid a business card across the table. James took it, noting the therapist's credentials while processing Rebecca's apparent thoroughness in addressing his conditions. "And finally," Rebecca said, her composure faltering slightly for the first time, "telling our families. I've already spoken to my parents." This was the most surprising revelation. Given Rebecca's strong resistance to this condition during their previous meeting, James had expected it to be the most contentious. "Point. You told them about the affair?" he asked, seeking clarification. Rebecca nodded, her eyes now shimmering with unshed tears. "Yesterday. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had. My father could barely look at me. My mother cried." She took a steadying breath. "But you were right. If we're going to try to rebuild, it can't be based on secrets and lies." James studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. What he saw instead was exhaustion, shame, and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Why the change?" he asked directly. "When we last spoke, you seemed particularly resistant to telling your parents." Rebecca looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "After our meeting, I went back to Ellie's and just fell apart. I realized I'd been living in a fantasy, thinking I could somehow minimize what I'd done or control how others perceived it." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "But more than that, I realized that your conditions weren't punishments. They were a roadmap for what genuine accountability looks like." Her voice grew quieter. "And I decided that if there was any chance of saving our marriage, I needed to take full responsibility for my actions, no matter how painful." James absorbed this, cautiously allowing himself to consider that her shift might be genuine. "What about David?" he asked, addressing the person who had been conspicuously absent from their discussion. "It's over," Rebecca said firmly. "Completely over. I've told him I won't be seeing him again, personally or socially. Until I can transfer to another school, our interaction will be strictly professional and minimal." She hesitated before adding, "He didn't take it well. He accused me of leading him on, said some ugly things. It confirmed that what I felt for him wasn't real. It was just flattery and attention that I mistook for something meaningful." James nodded, not offering sympathy, but acknowledging the information. "So you're agreeing to all 5 conditions?" "Yes," Rebecca said simply. "I am." The clarity of her response hung between them as James considered what came next. Her agreement to his conditions opened the door to possible reconciliation, but didn't guarantee it. There was still the question of whether he wanted to attempt rebuilding their marriage, even with these protections in place. "I need time to process this," he said finally. "Your agreement to the conditions is a positive step, but I still haven't decided if reconciliation is the right path for me." Rebecca nodded, acceptance rather than disappointment showing in her expression. "I understand. I'm not expecting an immediate answer. I just wanted you to know that I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to earn back your trust, if you decide that's what you want." As their meeting concluded, James felt a complex mixture of emotions. Cautious hope tempered by lingering doubt, appreciation for Rebecca's apparent accountability, alongside the still fresh pain of her betrayal. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time since discovering her affair, James allowed himself to consider that their marriage might survive. Changed, certainly, but perhaps not destroyed beyond repair. In the week following, Rebecca's acceptance of his conditions, James dedicated himself to careful reflection. This wasn't a decision to be made impulsively or emotionally. It would shape the rest of his life, determining whether he attempted to rebuild his marriage or began anew on his own. Catherine had returned to Seattle, though she called daily to check in. During one such conversation, she offered perspective that James found particularly valuable. "The question isn't whether you can forgive her," Catherine said thoughtfully. "It's whether the relationship you could build moving forward would be healthy and fulfilling for both of you. Forgiveness can happen regardless of whether you stay together." James considered this distinction carefully. He had been approaching the decision primarily through the lens of whether he could ever trust Rebecca again, but Catherine's framing shifted his perspective. Could they create something worth having, even after everything that had happened? Tuesday evening, James met Frank at a quiet pub near the older man's home. Over dinner, he shared Rebecca's acceptance of all his conditions and his ongoing deliberation about whether to attempt reconciliation. "You know," Frank said, setting down his glass, "when Elizabeth left me for another man, I was convinced that forgiving her would make me weak. I held on to that anger for years, thinking it protected me somehow." He paused, his weathered face thoughtful. "But I eventually realized that forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of resentment. Whether you rebuild with Rebecca or not, you'll need to forgive her eventually, for your own peace." "How do you do that?" James asked. "How do you forgive something that cuts so deep?" Frank smiled sadly. "Not all at once, that's for sure. It happens in layers, over time. Some days you'll feel you've moved past it. Other days the pain will feel fresh again. But gradually, the good days outnumber the bad." That night, James sat in his study long after Frank had driven him home, considering not just the betrayal, but the 12 years that had preceded it. The memories weren't all tainted. There had been genuine love, partnership, and growth together. Could those positive aspects provide enough foundation to build upon? The following day, James took a personal day from work and drove to the coast. The beach was nearly deserted in the cool spring weather, allowing him to walk for miles along. The shore, the rhythmic sound of waves providing a backdrop for his thoughts. As he walked, James realized he had been unconsciously searching for certainty, some clear sign that would tell him whether to try again with Rebecca or to end their marriage. But life rarely offered such clarity. Either path contained both potential for healing and risk of further pain. What finally shifted his perspective wasn't certainty, but a recognition of his own resilience. The past weeks had proven that he could face betrayal, establish boundaries, and navigate complex emotions without losing himself. Whatever he decided about his marriage, he would be okay. That evening, James called Rebecca and asked her to meet him at their home the following night. "I've made my decision," he said simply. When Rebecca arrived, she appeared nervous but composed. James invited her to sit in the living room, the space still noticeably emptier without the personal photos he had removed weeks earlier. "I've thought a lot about your acceptance of my conditions," he began, his voice steady. "I appreciate that you've taken concrete steps toward accountability." Rebecca nodded, waiting silently for him to continue. "I've decided that I'm willing to attempt reconciliation," James said, watching her face carefully. "Not because I've forgotten or fully processed what happened, but because I believe there might still be something worth saving between us." Relief washed over Rebecca's features, quickly followed by cautious hope. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know I don't deserve this chance." "This isn't about deserving," James clarified. It's about making a choice to see if we can build something healthy moving forward. I can't promise it will work. I can only promise to try with integrity and openness. That's all I can ask for, Rebecca replied, tears gathering in her eyes. There's something else you should understand, James continued. I'm not the same person I was before all this happened. My perspective has changed. My boundaries are different. If we do this, we're not trying to get back to how things were. We're creating something new. Rebecca nodded, wiping away a tear. I understand. I've changed too. As they began discussing practical next steps, when Rebecca would move back in, scheduling their first therapy appointment, finalizing the post-nuptial agreement, James felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was no triumphant sense of reconciliation, no dramatic reunion. Instead, there was a quiet determination to navigate this new territory with honesty and realistic expectations. Whether their marriage ultimately survived or not, James knew. He had remained true to himself through a devastating crisis. He had faced betrayal with dignity, established clear boundaries, and made decisions based on his values rather than fear or desperation. That integrity would serve him well, whatever the future held. 1 year later, James stood in the backyard, tending to the grill as guests mingled around the new fire pit he had finally built the previous summer. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the lawn where Marcus's daughters chased each other, their laughter punctuating the gentle hum of adult conversation. From his vantage point, James could see Rebecca, deep in conversation with Catherine, who had flown in for the weekend. The sight still occasionally struck him as surreal, his sister and his wife rebuilding their own relationship in parallel with his and Rebecca's ongoing work to reconstruct their marriage. The past year had been neither simple nor linear. There had been breakthroughs and setbacks, moments of genuine connection and periods of lingering doubt. The weekly therapy sessions had often been grueling, forcing both of them to confront painful truths about themselves and their relationship. Rebecca had kept her word about all 5 conditions. She had signed the post-nuptial agreement after her attorney reviewed it. She had maintained complete transparency, never objecting when James occasionally checked her phone or email, though he found himself doing so less frequently as months passed. She had secured a position at Riverside High School and severed all contact with David. She had participated fully in therapy, both individual and couples, and she had maintained honesty with their families about what had happened and the work they were doing to heal. Need any help with those burgers? Frank asked, approaching the grill with 2 cold beers, offering one to James. Thanks, James said, accepting the beer. I think I've got it under control, Frank nodded, surveying the gathering. Quite a difference from where you were this time last year. James followed his mentor's gaze, taking in the scene, friends and family together, his marriage slowly healing, his life reclaiming a sense of stability he had once feared lost forever. It's still a work in progress, James admitted. Some days are easier than others. That's life, Frank said with the wisdom of his years. The question isn't whether you've eliminated all difficulty, but whether you're facing it with integrity. The conversation shifted to other topics. Frank's new woodworking project, James's recent promotion at work, but the older man's observation lingered in James's mind throughout the evening. Later, after their guests had departed and they were cleaning up together, Rebecca paused, dish towel in hand. Today was nice, she said, her eyes meeting his with a hint of the old warmth they had once taken for granted. It was, James agreed. Catherine mentioned she had a good talk with you. Rebecca nodded. She told me she's proud of the work we're doing. That meant a lot coming from her. They continued working in companionable silence for a few minutes before Rebecca spoke again. You know, I was thinking today about how your response to my request changed everything. Not just for us, but for others too. James raised an eyebrow questioningly. Ellie told me she ended things with that married colleague she'd been seeing, Rebecca explained. She said watching what happened with us made her reevaluate her choices. And my parents, they've started going to counseling to address issues they've ignored for decades. James hadn't been aware of these developments. I hadn't thought about the wider impact, he admitted. Your clarity forced others to confront their own situations with honesty, Rebecca said, including me. As they finished cleaning and prepared for bed, James reflected on the journey of the past year. The marriage they were rebuilding wasn't the same as the one they had before. In some ways, it was more deliberate, more conscious, lacking the easy comfort of unquestioned trust, but gaining something valuable in its commitment to honesty and growth. Whether this new marriage would last another year or another decade remained uncertain. James had come to accept that certainty was never guaranteed in relationships, regardless of vows or intentions. What he could guarantee was his own commitment to living with integrity, to maintaining boundaries that reflected his values, and to making choices based on clear-eyed assessment rather than fear or habit. Standing on the back porch alone after Rebecca had gone upstairs, James looked up at the stars scattered across the night sky. The pain of betrayal had diminished over time, though it would always be part of their story. What had emerged from that crucible, however, was a deeper understanding of himself, his strength, his resilience, and his capacity to face life's challenges without compromising his principles. His one condition, honesty, had transformed not just his marriage but his entire approach to life. By refusing to accept deception, even when confronting the truth was painful, he had created space for authentic connection and genuine growth. And in the end, that clarity had become the foundation for everything that followed, not just for him and Rebecca, but for the wider circle of people whose lives had been touched by their story. The ripples of his principled stand continued to spread outward, encouraging others to examine their own choices and consider whether they too might benefit from greater honesty in their relationships. As James turned to go inside, he carried with him the quiet confidence of someone who had faced his greatest fear, the collapse of his marriage, and discovered that maintaining his integrity mattered more than any specific outcome. Whatever the future held, that discovery would continue to guide his path forward, illuminating the way even through life's darkest moments. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.